Have you ever watched your dignity get shredded in exactly 5 seconds? The harsh rip of my supply chain schematic echoed in a room reeking of expensive perfume. The woman across the desk glared, calling me a worthless reject. She had no idea that by throwing those scraps at my face, she just signed her own termination. The corporate throne she clung to was merely a pawn in my family empire. The deadliest predators never make a sound. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to sustain their lives and continue creating these stories for you. You can support us by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the donate link in the description and pinned comment of this video. Thank you so much for your kindness. My name is Lucy Holmes, and this is the story of how one terrible job interview became the catalyst for dismantling a corporate tyrant. The rain in Chicago always had a way of chilling you straight to the bone, but the atmosphere inside the towering glass-walled headquarters of Vanguard Nexus was entirely devoid of warmth long before I even stepped out of the elevator. I walked into the sprawling corporate office for an interview for the Senior Strategy Specialist position. I had spent the last 3 weeks preparing meticulously for this exact moment. I had mapped out their entire supply chain, identifying critical bottlenecks that were quietly bleeding their quarterly revenue. I was ready, armed with 5 years of brutal, hands-on experience on the warehouse floor. The woman sitting across the expansive mahogany desk was Catherine Vance, the head of human resources. She was the quintessential corporate gatekeeper, the kind of person who worshipped at the altar of Ivy League degrees and exclusive country club memberships. Her office reeked of an overpowering, expensive floral perfume that caught in the back of my throat. From the exact second I sat down in the uncomfortable guest chair, her disdain was palpable. She did not even offer a basic, polite greeting. Instead, she picked up my printed resume with the very tips of her perfectly manicured fingers, treating the piece of paper as if it might physically infect her with mediocrity. She sighed heavily, rolling her eyes as they scanned the lines of my background. "I see here you took a gap year in the middle of your undergraduate studies," she said, her voice dripping with an icy condescension. I kept my posture straight and explained calmly that my father had fallen severely ill, and I had been forced to pause my education to work full-time just to cover his mounting medical bills. I genuinely thought that level of perseverance and loyalty would count for something in the real world. I tried to shift the focus, pointing out my 5 years of practical warehouse management experience, navigating the chaotic reality of heavy logistics, managing teams of truck drivers, and fixing operational failures on the ground floor. Catherine let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed against the glass walls. She waved her hand dismissively, completely invalidating half a decade of my sweat, early mornings, and exhausted nights. "Manual labor does not translate to high-level corporate strategy," she stated, leaning back into her plush leather chair as if I had just insulted her intelligence. I tried to salvage the situation and steer the conversation back to the comprehensive optimization plan I had brought. I slid the neatly bound folder across the smooth surface of the desk. Catherine did not even bother to open the cover. She stood up, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, in one swift, deliberate, and theatrical motion. She grabbed my meticulously prepared dossier and ripped it violently straight down the middle. The sound of tearing paper was deafeningly loud in the dead quiet of the room. She tossed the shredded pieces over the edge of the desk, letting them flutter to the floor right by my shoes. "You are just a reject, discarded by society," she sneered, looking down her nose at me with a look of absolute unadulterated disgust. "Do not bring this trashed resume to dirty my office." For a fraction of a second, the entire world seemed to stop spinning. Most people would have burst into tears. Most people would have yelled, screamed, or stormed out of the room with their faces burning hot with humiliation. I did absolutely none of those things. I slowly knelt down onto the carpet and calmly gathered the torn pages from the floor. smoothing out the jagged edges with my thumbs. My mind was shockingly clear. I was consumed not by shame, but by a profound, almost clinical amazement at her staggering, blinding short-sightedness. Catherine Vance was incredibly proud of her position, her corner office, and her perceived power in this building. What she absolutely did not know, and what was absent from the heavily redacted public resume I had provided, was that Vanguard Nexus was merely a small subsidiary, and I, Lucy Holmes, the woman she had just looked dead in the eye and called a worthless reject, was the sole legal heir and the rightful owner of 51% of Omni Holding. That was the parent conglomerate that funded, supplied, and completely controlled every single inch of the empire she was so arrogantly standing inside. I stood back up, holding the ruined papers tightly against my chest. I did not say a single word in response to her vile insult. I simply turned on my heel and walked out through the heavy glass door. The elevator ride down to the ground floor felt like an absolute eternity. The moment the lobby doors slid open, the late afternoon Chicago drizzle hit my face. The freezing air snapped my senses sharply into focus. I shoved my hands deep into the pockets of my heavy wool coat, desperately trying to steady them. They were trembling, but not from the bitter wind. They were shaking from the sheer, raw force of the adrenaline surging through my veins. Every single word she had spat at me played on a continuous, echoing loop in my head. I was not going to forget a single syllable. I was going to take all of her cruelty, forge it into an unbreakable weapon, and I was going to tear down her fragile, arrogant little kingdom piece by piece. I sat motionless behind the steering wheel of my battered 12-year-old Ford sedan as the cold rain hammered against the windshield. The engine idled with a rough sputter, the heater struggling violently to fight off the pervasive dampness of the late afternoon. I did not reach for my phone to call my family. I did not seek comfort, nor did I shed a single tear of frustration. Emotion was a liability right now. I chose the path of a seasoned operator. I flipped open my rugged laptop, illuminating the dark, freezing cabin with its harsh white glow, connecting to a secure mobile hotspot. I opened a blank encrypted document and began typing a clinically precise incident report, documenting every single spoken word and aggressive action from the interview. I addressed the email directly to Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was a senior partner, the primary legal representative of my family trust, and a supreme board member of Omni Holding. He was a silent titan who managed the shadows of our empire, a man who could dismantle a corporation before finishing his morning coffee. My message was entirely devoid of personal grievance. Arthur, attached is a verified field report detailing a severe breach of professional conduct and ethical standards by the head of human resources at Vanguard Nexus. Log this into the internal oversight system. Make no overt moves. I will handle the execution. Exactly 2 minutes later, my inbox chimed. His response contained exactly 3 words. Message received, safely. No questions asked, no unnecessary corporate pleasantries. A heavy, terrifying silence began to descend over the invisible superstructure of the company. The guillotine had been raised, and Catherine Vance was standing directly underneath it, completely oblivious. While the trap was being quietly calibrated, I refused to sit idle and simply wait for the gears to turn. Vengeance required momentum. For the next 3 weeks, I continued my parallel life, operating undercover as an independent logistics consultant for Apex Freight. They were a scrappy, mid-sized regional transport competitor, operating out of a cinder block dispatch center that smelled perpetually of stale coffee, wet cardboard, and diesel fuel. It was the exact opposite of the sterile, perfumed halls of Vanguard Nexus. It was a place of calloused hands and grueling 14-hour shifts. I spent my days analyzing transit vectors, optimizing freight loads, and auditing digital manifests alongside men and women who actually kept the supply chain alive. It was during a deep dive into the regional routing algorithms on a late Tuesday evening that I struck gold. I detected a glaring, catastrophic anomaly in the regional data pool. Massive clusters of proprietary shipping manifests, exclusive client addresses, and sensitive transit schedules belonging entirely to Vanguard Nexus were floating in unsecured, third-party vendor servers. It was a massive data hemorrhage. I traced the digital breadcrumbs backward, bypassing weak firewalls and tracking the access tokens to a newly implemented analytics initiative at Vanguard. Someone had bypassed standard internal security protocols to hire a cheap, unvetted offshore data management firm. I accessed the digital authorization forms to see exactly who had overridden the information technology department and rushed the vendor onboarding process. There it was. The digital signature glowing brightly on my screen belonged to Catherine Vance. She had fast-tracked the external personnel contracts, likely to boast about cutting departmental budgets by 40%, completely ignoring mandatory security compliance checks. The very woman who prided herself on elite standards had just compromised the entire operational integrity of the company. A dark, icy amusement settled over me. I leaned back in my cheap plastic chair and pulled up my professional networking feed, almost as if the universe was offering me a punchline. Catherine had just published a lengthy, self-congratulatory article. It was a masterclass in corporate hypocrisy. The title read in bold letters, "Protecting the Elite Bloodline: Why Gatekeeping Quality is Crucial for Corporate Excellence." I read through the sickeningly arrogant paragraphs. She pontificated about weeding out low-quality personnel and refusing to settle for societal rejects who lack the proper pedigree. She proudly wrote about how a true executive must have the courage to ruthlessly discard inadequate talent to protect the purity of the corporate ecosystem. It was a thinly veiled, public mockery of my interview. She was actively seeking applause from her echo chamber of elite connections, soaking in the digital validation. She thought she was an untouchable apex predator culling the weak. She did not realize she had just handed me the exact weapon I would use to utterly destroy her career. The invisible machinery of omni-holding shifted into a higher, much more dangerous gear. Arthur Pendleton did not rely on standard, sluggish corporate reprimands. He initiated a full-scale, aggressive shadow protocol. Less than 48 hours after my initial message, an independent risk assessment and compliance firm descended upon the Human Resources Department of Vanguard Nexus. They wore sharp, identical charcoal suits and spoke in hushed, legally precise tones. Officially, the sudden presence of these auditors was classified as a routine mid-year procedural review. Unofficially, it was a highly targeted, merciless excavation. They immediately began pulling years of server logs, archiving supposedly deleted emails, and reviewing the staggeringly high employee turnover rates within Catherine's specific jurisdiction. Over the past 3 years, the sheer number of early resignations and abrupt dismissals under her direct management was statistically terrifying. Yet, Catherine, deeply blinded by her own manufactured sense of absolute untouchability, simply waved the auditors off as a minor, annoying bureaucratic formality from the legal department. While the auditors quietly mapped the perimeter of her toxic kingdom, the truly devastating piece of evidence came directly to me, completely unprompted. It was exactly 11:45 on a rainy Thursday night when a bright notification chimed on my encrypted secondary device. It was a direct message originating from an untraceable, anonymous social media account. The sender identified themselves only as a former talent acquisition coordinator who had worked directly under Catherine for 18 agonizing months. The message was brief, but it was incredibly heavy with the lingering trauma of someone who had barely survived a psychological meat grinder. "I heard through the grapevine what happened during your interview," the message read, the text glowing starkly against the dark screen of my phone. "You are not the first one. Please, if you have any power at all, make it stop. I cannot sleep at night knowing she is still doing this to vulnerable people." Attached to the message was a massive, heavily encrypted file folder. I downloaded the drive, brewed a pot of black coffee, and spent the next 6 straight hours staring directly into the abyss of Catherine Vance's daily operations. The folder contained over 250 individual screenshots of private Slack channels and locked managerial group chats. The sheer volume of casual, calculated cruelty was staggering. Catherine had not just been having a bad day when she ripped up my resume. This was her established standard operating procedure. She ruthlessly mocked candidates who could not afford expensive tailored suits, referring to them in the chats as poverty hires and genetic dead ends. She frequently shared links to the private social media profiles of vulnerable applicants, actively inviting her elite inner circle of sycophants to brutally ridicule their modest living conditions or their community college degrees. In one horrifying exchange, she joked about intentionally scheduling interviews for single mothers at 5 o'clock in the evening, just to watch them panic about finding childcare, solely for her own twisted entertainment. The anonymous whistleblower confessed that Catherine's relentless, daily campaign of targeted humiliation had ultimately driven them into a severe clinical depression, resulting in 6 months of intensive psychiatric therapy just to be able to function in a normal workplace again. A cold, hard realization settled heavily in my chest. Catherine Vance was not just a mean-spirited, arrogant middle manager, she was a systemic corporate disease. She had deliberately engineered her entire department to function as a miniature empire of psychological violence, a dark corner where she could act out her twisted superiority complex with absolute impunity. The corporate hierarchy of Vanguard Nexus had unknowingly provided her with a heavily funded, completely unchecked playground to systematically destroy the self-worth of anyone she deemed beneath her rigid, archaic social standards. This was no longer just about exacting a calculated personal revenge for a torn resume and a few insults. This was an extermination protocol. I was going to completely sterilize the entire department. While the invisible legal and human resources trap was wrapping tightly around her throat, Catherine was completely oblivious, living her absolute best life in the upper echelons of the city. On Friday evening, while I was carefully compiling the final evidentiary dossiers with Arthur, Catherine was out sipping $30 craft cocktails at an exclusive, glass-enclosed rooftop lounge in downtown Chicago. The glittering city skyline illuminated her arrogance. According to her very public social media feed, she was having an absolutely fantastic, victorious week. She posted a heavily filtered, glamorous photograph of herself holding a crystal martini glass, accompanied by a lengthy, self-absorbed caption. "Closing out another phenomenal week of high-level execution," she wrote. "Manifesting that girl boss energy, true leadership means never apologizing for raising the standard, even if it means breaking a few fragile egos along the way. Stay elite." She was actively celebrating her perceived dominance, completely unaware that she was dancing gleefully on a trapdoor that was about to swing wide open. The final piece of the sequence fell into place at exactly 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Every single member of the Vanguard Nexus Executive Board, along with all senior department heads, received a high-priority, red-flagged email. It bypassed all standard secretarial filters and pinged directly to their personal devices. The sender was the Supreme Executive Council of Omni Holding. The subject line was chillingly vague and carried the weight of a legal subpoena. It read, "Mandatory Extraordinary Strategic Summit." The mandate required their physical presence in the main executive boardroom at 9 o'clock sharp on Saturday morning. There were no attached agendas, no preliminary briefing notes to study, and absolutely no room for negotiation or rescheduling. At the very bottom of the severe, legally binding text, there was a single, highly specific addendum typed in bold red lettering. The physical attendance of the head of human resources, Catherine Vance, is strictly mandatory. Failure to comply will result in the immediate and irrevocable termination of all corporate privileges. The profound, suffocating silence that must have fallen over her perfumed corner office upon reading those exact words was the precise silence I had been waiting for all week. The hunt was officially over. It was time for the slaughter. Saturday morning arrived with a deceptive, tranquil calm over the city. In her luxury penthouse apartment overlooking the gray waters of the lake, Catherine Vance was busy wrapping herself in a shroud of pure, unadulterated delusion. She had spent the entire evening prior successfully convincing herself that the mandatory, ominous summons from the Omni Holding Supreme Executive Council was actually a heavily veiled surprise ceremony. In her deeply twisted reality, She believed she was about to be officially crowned as the global director of human resources. She reasoned that her ruthless, sociopathic budget cuts and her relentless culling of the workforce had finally caught the attention of the apex predators at the very top of the food chain. To meet her imaginary coronation, she had selected a striking, tailored crimson-red power suit. It was the exact kind of outfit designed specifically to pull all the oxygen out of a room and demand absolute submission. She stood before her oversized vanity mirror, meticulously applying her signature ruby red lipstick, silently rehearsing a falsely modest acceptance speech about driving elite excellence and trimming the pathetic corporate fat. While Catherine was busy practicing her victorious smile, I was already navigating the labyrinthine, silent corridors of the executive floor. Arthur Pendleton had sent me a secure access token just before dawn. I deliberately chose an outfit that practically screamed absolute invisibility. I wore a plain charcoal gray knit sweater, simple dark slacks, and sensible flat shoes. I looked exactly like an entry-level stenographer or a junior paralegal. When I entered the cavernous, amphitheater-style boardroom, I bypassed the massive, polished mahogany table completely. Instead, I took a seat in the absolute farthest corner of the back row, a dimly lit section historically reserved for silent, note-taking assistants. I completely submerged myself in the shadows, crossing my arms and quietly waiting for the theater to begin. At exactly 8:45 in the morning, the heavy double doors swung open, and Catherine made her grand theatrical entrance. She strode into the room radiating an almost radioactive level of smugness. She offered tight, condescending smiles to the regional vice presidents, treating them as if they were suddenly her direct subordinates. But as she made her confident way toward the primary executive seating area, her sharp eyes scanned the perimeter and abruptly locked onto my silhouette resting in the back corner. For a split second, a flicker of genuine confusion crossed her perfectly contoured face, but because her ego was entirely bulletproof, the confusion instantly morphed into aggressive amusement. Instead of feeling a sudden sense of impending dread at my impossible presence in a restricted area, she actually adjusted her designer leather portfolio and marched straight over to my shadowy corner. She leaned down, the suffocating scent of her expensive floral perfume heavily invading my personal space, and whispered directly into my ear. "Are you actually stalking me all the way up here?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and utter superiority. "I do not know exactly whose security badge you stole to sneak into the executive suite, but you are completely out of your mind. Sit tight. Let us see how the armed security guards drag a ragged reject like you out into the street once the meeting starts." I did not blink. I did not move a single muscle. I simply looked up at her, offering a faint, chilling smile, and gestured politely toward the empty leather chair waiting for her at the front of the room. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy doors slammed shut with a definitive, final thud. The electronic deadbolts engaged automatically, sealing every single person inside. The low murmur of executive chatter died instantly. The executive chairman of Vanguard Nexus, a stern man with silver hair, stepped up to the main acrylic podium. He gripped the edges of the stand, his knuckles turning completely white, looking as though he was physically nauseous. Catherine sat up perfectly straight, proudly adjusting her bright red jacket lapels, practically vibrating with anticipation for her name to be called for her grand promotion. "We are completely bypassing the quarterly revenue reports this morning," the chairman stated, his voice totally devoid of any corporate warmth. "We have been directed by the Supreme Board to address an immediate, catastrophic internal crisis." The massive wall-to-wall digital projection screen behind him flared to life. Catherine leaned forward, fully expecting to see her beautiful promotion graphics. Instead, giant, bold, blood-red letters materialized across the glaring white screen. The title slide read, "Cultural Risk and Corporate Moral Decay." Catherine's confident smirk faltered for the very first time. With a sharp click of the presentation remote, the chairman advanced to the first exhibit. It was not a financial chart or a productivity graph. It was a massive, high-definition screenshot of Catherine's exact social media post from the night before, the one arrogantly celebrating her girl boss energy and her proud philosophy of discarding weak applicants. The room grew unbelievably, uncomfortably silent. The chairman clicked the remote again. The giant screen instantly shattered into a chaotic mosaic of dozens of intercepted internal messaging channels. Every single vile, degrading comment Catherine had made about poverty hires, cheap suits, and desperate single mothers was now fully illuminated under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom for the entire executive team to read. But the absolute final nail in the coffin was the audio. The security department had bypassed the standard presentation inputs and integrated the room's expensive surround sound speakers to play the intercepted, private voice memos she had sent to her underlings over the past 2 years. Her own voice, dripping with heavy malice and cruel laughter, suddenly echoed violently off the walls, openly mocking the desperate pleas of an entry-level candidate. The sheer, concentrated toxicity of her private empire was no longer a hidden secret. It was the main feature presentation. The silver-haired chairman stepped away from the main acrylic podium, making room for a man who had been standing quietly in the shadows near the heavy double doors. It was Arthur Pendleton. He wore a perfectly tailored, immaculate midnight blue suit and carried a single, slim leather folder. The sheer gravity of his presence instantly sucked whatever remaining oxygen was left in the room. As Arthur walked to the center of the executive floor, the vibrant, flushed pink color of arrogant victory completely drained from Catherine Vance's face. Within seconds, her complexion turned a sickly, pale white, leaving her looking exactly like a terrified wax mannequin trapped inside a stolen red jacket. Arthur did not even bother to use the microphone. His voice, deep and resonant, commanded absolute, terrifying authority. "Catherine Vance," Arthur began, his tone cold enough to freeze boiling water. "I am not standing here today to discuss your grotesque lack of basic human decency. That particular rot is already on full display behind me. I am here to discuss the highly specific, undocumented expenditure of $875,000. Arthur slowly opened the leather folder, the crisp sound of the paper echoing in the dead silence. "Over the past 24 months, you have actively bypassed the Central Financial Oversight Committee of this subsidiary. Our forensic auditors discovered that you authorized exactly 7 separate, highly classified severance payouts. You used these funds to permanently silence vulnerable candidates and former employees who were actively preparing massive discrimination and severe emotional distress lawsuits against Vanguard Nexus. You deliberately routed this money through a dummy vendor account originally designated for third-party recruitment software. You effectively used our corporate operational budgets as your own personal slush fund to cover up your recreational cruelty and legal liabilities." The regional vice presidents sitting around the massive mahogany table, the very same men Catherine had smiled at so confidently just 20 minutes prior, now physically recoiled from her, looking at her as if she were a live explosive device. Catherine gripped the edge of the polished table. Her carefully manicured nails dug into the hard wood. She aggressively pushed her chair back and stood up. She was desperately trying to project her usual intimidating authority, but her knees were visibly shaking beneath the table. "Mr. Pendleton, with all due respect, you are looking at this entire situation entirely out of context," she stammered, her voice shrill, defensive, and dripping with a toxic desperation. "I made those difficult executive decisions specifically to protect the elite brand identity of Vanguard Nexus. I was maintaining our incredibly high standards. Do you have any idea how much time and resources are utterly wasted by uneducated, unqualified rejects trying to infiltrate our corporate ecosystem, people without the proper degrees, people who do not belong in this tier of the business world? I was doing my job. I was filtering out the trash to keep this company at the absolute top of the industry." Arthur stared at her with the cold, unblinking eyes of a seasoned executioner. He allowed her vile defense to hang in the dead, silent air of the boardroom for 5 agonizing seconds. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice in anger. He simply leaned slightly forward and delivered the fatal blow with surgical precision. Filtering out the trash, Arthur repeated slowly, tasting the sheer, blinding audacity of her words. Tell me, Catherine, do you have any idea who the quote-unquote reject is that you dealt with last Tuesday afternoon, the young woman whose professional resume you physically tore in half and threw on the floor? The very same woman you just threatened to have forcefully removed by armed security less than 15 minutes ago. Catherine frowned deeply, her mind scrambling frantically to connect the dots, her eyes darting nervously around the hostile room. Before she could formulate a single syllable of a response, Arthur pressed a button on the presentation remote. The horrifying mosaic of her toxic chat logs vanished from the giant screen. In its place, a crisp, incredibly official legal document materialized. The gold seal of the Supreme Federal Financial Regulatory Commission was stamped clearly in the top right corner. The bold black title across the top of the screen read, Supreme Shareholder Registry of Omni Holding Incorporated. The executives in the room audibly gasped. Omni Holding was the monolithic parent entity, the invisible giant that fully funded, owned, and controlled every single asset of Vanguard Nexus. The digital registry scrolled down automatically, completely bypassing the minor institutional investors and the standard executive stock options. It stopped dead at the very top of the entire global capital structure. There, displayed in massive, undeniable letters, was the supreme owner of the assets, holding the ultimate majority voting rights over the entire global board of directors. The name glowed brightly on the screen, Lucy Elaine Holmes. Total ownership share 51%. Time in the boardroom completely ceased to exist. The silence was no longer just quiet. It was a heavy physical weight, a crushing, suffocating atmospheric pressure that pinned every single executive tightly to their luxurious leather chairs. Nobody dared to take a breath. Slowly, agonizingly, as if her neck was made of rusted iron. Catherine Vance rotated her head away from the giant glowing screen. She looked past the rows of terrified executives, past Arthur Pendleton, and stared directly toward the very back corner of the room. The shadows seemed to part. I was sitting exactly where I had been since the very beginning, my plain charcoal sweater blending seamlessly into the dark upholstery. I casually lifted a delicate porcelain cup of chamomile tea to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. I gently placed the cup back down onto its saucer. The tiny clink of the porcelain echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I did not break eye contact with her. In that singular, beautifully quiet moment, the entire elaborate illusion of Catherine's power, her elite status, and her untouchable corporate throne instantly shattered into a million invisible pieces. Her manufactured superiority burst apart exactly like a fragile, pathetic soap bubble hitting a solid concrete floor. The mighty gatekeeper suddenly realized she had just locked herself outside of her own castle. The terrifying reality finally shattered the last remaining fragments of Catherine's pride. She began to tremble violently. Stumbling backward from the giant screen, she frantically pushed past the frozen executives and rushed wildly toward my shadowy corner of the room. She lunged forward, desperately trying to grab my hands, her previous venom entirely replaced by a pathetic, weeping panic. "Please, Miss Holmes, please," she begged, her voice cracking as tears ruined her immaculate makeup. "This is all just a terrible misunderstanding. It was just a high-pressure stress test for the interview process. I swear I did not mean any of it." I calmly stood up from my chair. Easily stepping back to avoid her frantic, grasping fingers, I did not raise my voice, and I did not display a single ounce of anger. Slowly, I reached into my simple canvas bag. I withdrew a clear plastic folder and placed it gently onto the polished mahogany table, right in front of her trembling hands. Inside the folder were the exact same pages of my operational plan that she had so violently ripped apart, now meticulously taped back together. I looked directly into her terrified, tear-filled eyes and spoke with a quiet, undeniable authority. "You were right about one thing. Catherine, I was someone who could not finish my university degree on time because of a devastating family crisis. But a piece of paper does not define the fundamental value of a human being, and your temporary corporate power does not give you the right to trample on anyone's dignity. Today, you do not just lose your job, you are permanently blacklisted from stepping foot inside any company within the entire Omni Holding ecosystem across the United States of America. Right on cue, the heavy double doors swung open. Two uniformed security officers stepped into the boardroom. Arthur walked over to Catherine, who was now sobbing uncontrollably, and simply held out his hand. With shaking fingers, she unclipped her Elite Executive Access badge and dropped it into his palm. Arthur pulled a pair of steel scissors from his inner jacket pocket and, in front of the entire terrified executive board, snipped the heavy plastic badge completely in half. It was a poetic, definitive echo of the exact sound she had made tearing my resume. The security guards grabbed her by the arms. She was immediately escorted out of the building with absolutely nothing, her entire career in human resources permanently extinguished. I did not walk over to take her empty leather chair. I had zero interest in her petty throne. Instead, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the sprawling, bustling streets of Chicago. I turned back to Arthur and the deeply shaken board of directors. I issued my first official mandate, a complete, ground-up overhaul of the entire recruitment protocol, prioritizing raw talent and practical, hard-fought experience over elitist pedigrees. I did not claim this victory by simply flexing my wealth. I took back justice by proving one undeniable truth. When you own the entire concrete foundation, those who arrogantly dance on the roof will inevitably come crashing down. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping us out with just a $1 donation. You can scan the QR code right here on the screen, or use the donation link provided in the description and pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our amazing staff, helping them feed their families and continue creating even better stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again, and take care.